Hi, KRB teachers. Welcome to week 6 in the Maximinds Mental Healthcare webinar series. Today we are looking at self-awareness, including understanding your teaching style. A reminder of the 8-part webinar series. And of course, today, week 6 is self-awareness. Starting straight away with the introduction, what are we going to be learning about today? Firstly, what is self-awareness and what are the benefits of having self-awareness? How do you as teachers gain internal self-awareness? How do you understand your own strengths, interests, and values? And how do you learn your teaching style? How do you gain external self-awareness? And finally, what are the barriers to self-awareness? So here is an outline of what today looks like as we just went through. A reminder that in week 4, we looked at strengths, interests, and values and how to fully understand your students. And then today we're looking at self-awareness and understanding yourself. So when we looked at strengths, interests, and values in your students, that was interpersonal awareness. But of course, today we're looking at intrapersonal awareness and really helping you to understand yourself. So this is the difference in those two. So interpersonal is how do you think about your students versus intrapersonal is how you think about yourself. So starting with what is self-awareness and how is it defined? Again, to go back to ancient Greece times, Aristotle first said, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. So it's actually a form of clearly wisdom. Daniel Goleman is a famous psychologist, and he defines self-awareness as the first component of emotional intelligence, so EQ. Self-awareness means having a deep understanding of one's emotions, strengths, weaknesses, needs, and drives. People with strong self-awareness are neither overly critical nor unrealistically hopeful. Rather, they're honest with themselves and with others. And we'll come back to this last bit in terms of how it relates to mental well-being as well. Another way to define self-awareness is the ability to see yourself clearly and objectively through reflection and introspection. And finally, it's having a conscious knowledge of your own characters and feelings. Self-awareness has been defined as having 3 categories. So what am I thinking? What am I feeling? And what am I doing? This will look quite similar to what we've already explored in terms of cognitive behavior therapy, which does look at the interaction between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So in that regard, exploring your self-awareness and looking at what you are thinking and feeling and doing in the process is almost like a form of cognitive behavior therapy, which is, of course, what we use as psychologists on a day-to-day basis with clients. So it helps to give you that introspective reflection on your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Self-awareness can also be defined in terms of 2 different types: internal self-awareness and external self-awareness. So as you can see on the left here, internal is really knowing what we think of ourselves and having a clear picture of ourselves. External self-awareness is knowing what other people think of us and having a really clear concept in terms of other people's perception of us. To go into detail further, internal self-awareness is that we clearly see our own factors such as values, passions, aspirations, how we fit within our environment, our reactions, including thoughts, feelings, behaviors, strengths and weaknesses, and also our impact on others. So a very clear understanding of ourselves. Another form of self-awareness being external then is how we clearly see how other people view us in terms of those same qualities. So really understanding other people's concept of ourselves. Not sure who's familiar with the Johari window, and if not, I will show you how we've almost reinterpreted that to apply to self-awareness. But basically it looks at the interaction between what's known and unknown to ourselves and what's unknown and known to other people. In this case, we're applying the same Johari window in looking at external and internal self-awareness and having a low or high level of each of those. So for instance, in the top right hand corner, having a high internal self-awareness would be knowing that we know ourselves, and then a high external self-awareness would be knowing what other people think of us and having that quite clear and obvious lens which applies to both ourselves and our self-concept, but also what other people think of us. On the flip side, you can also have a low sense of internal self-awareness and not really know who you are, and likewise not really know how other people see you. So that would be the bottom left hand quadrant. As you can see though, they're not linked or related. So you can have a high self-awareness, external self-awareness, but also a low internal self-awareness, and vice versa. So they're not linked, correlated at all, and both are equally important in terms of developing this overall sense of self-awareness, whether that be internal and or external. So here, as we just looked at, if you do have a high internal self-awareness and really know who you are and have your own quite firm understanding of yourself, and you also have a pretty clear understanding of what other people think of you, that's where we think of people that are aware. In that second example I gave before, if you're not really sure who you are and you're also not sure of what other people think of you, that's where what we call seekers. So they're not really sure who they are, and particularly how their team sees them or other people. So you might feel stuck or frustrated. As you can see here, we've also got someone that may have a high internal self-awareness, so really know who they are, but not really understand what other people think of them. So that's more introspectors. They look quite closely at themselves. And the flip side of that is high internal self-awareness. So really knowing, low internal self-awareness. So not really knowing who you are, but being quite concerned with how other people see you. And that's where we have pleasers, which we also would be familiar with. So those people that wanting to always please other people without necessarily knowing who they are themselves. Any which way you look at it, but I guess the most important takeaway is that there are a number of different levels in terms of how you understand yourself, but also how you understand other people to understand you. And it's about looking at, well, what's the conscious awareness, but also subconscious and unconscious awareness as well. And that applies for both yourself, but also your understanding of how other people see you. So what are the benefits of having self-awareness, and ideally internal and external self-awareness? So as we looked at, these are the two types. They have different benefits depending on whether you're high on internal and or external. So as I mentioned, they're not necessarily related. So those with internal self-awareness, and remember, this is the one who you really know yourself. You really aren't sure of who you are. You know your values, your passions, frustrations, etc. This tends to link to greater job satisfaction. So hopefully you enjoy being a teacher more. This links to greater relationship satisfaction. So not only who you work with, for instance, at King Koppel, but also your relationships outside. Personal and social control is linked to greater happiness and less anxiety, stress, and depression. On the other hand, having external self-awareness, so really knowing what other people think of you, is more linked to being more skilled at empathy, of course, because you can understand other people's perspectives. So therefore, it's also better at being able to, you're also better at being able to take on others' views, ultimately have better relationships and greater relationship satisfaction. General benefits for self-awareness, and particularly for teachers, are things like greater confidence, more creativity. Self-awareness has been linked to better decision-making. You build stronger relationships, communicate more effectively, less likely to lie, steal, or cheat. I'm sure that's not happening anyway. Good news, more likely to get more promotions. You're a more satisfied worker. People with self-awareness have been found to have been better at leadership skills and roles. And ultimately, the three that I want to explore further is that if you have self-awareness, you have a more realistic sense obviously, of yourself, particularly if you have that high internal self-awareness we just looked at. Greater mental health and well-being. And this particularly obviously applies for when we have that greater sense of external self-awareness, because we're able to be more realistic and understand what is the perspective of other people and how that links to ourselves. And finally, better role models for students by having self-awareness, because you're more able to identify and understand who you are as a person and ultimately your impact on other people. So in terms of those last three, I want to go back to Daniel Goleman's definition of self-awareness as one of the key factors of emotional intelligence, and EQ, and even by the book on the right, you can see here why it can matter more than EQ. And this is a big movement that has been going on for years, which is saying that ultimately things like IQ gets you in the door for a job, but EQ gets you promoted, and how EQ is ultimately going to be increasingly a greater predictor of things like leadership, but also success at life and beyond just the workplace as well. So he said particularly, people with strong self-awareness are neither overly critical nor unrealistically hopeful. So rather, they're honest with themselves and with others. And what this means ultimately is that there's that realist element. You're in touch with not only yourself and who you are, but also what other people think of you, which is, of course, has benefits both in the workplace and outside. So I think the key takeaway here really is that you're objective and honest, not living in some fantasy world that you've got a certain concept of yourself that other people don't necessarily have, or vice versa, that you don't have a strong sense of self, but other people really know who you are. So ultimately, not critical and not delusional or hopeful, but just realistic. As we know, being realistic rather than delusional is a huge indicator of mental health and well-being. And this is something that we at Maximinds particularly think is very important in terms of being realistic and knowing what your strengths, values, interests, contributions are, can really help to foster that sense of mental health and well-being. So another reason ultimately why having a good sense of self-awareness is good for you, to be in touch with reality and not sitting in that more delusional or out of touch space, and not being, as Daniel Goleman mentioned, unrealistically hopeful or unrealistically critical or things like that. You as teachers may have heard of Albert Bandura as a prominent social psychologist and also one of the researchers in the Bobo doll experiments. For those that aren't aware, basically what happened was there was an actress or actor that emulated like a teacher role, for example, in that top line, who would come in and treat Bobo dolls in an quite a violent and aggressive way, yelling at them, physically hurting them. And then they sent children in to go and behave with the Bobo dolls however they wished. Not surprisingly, the children would vicariously learn or observe what the teacher had done and then would act in a similar way. And as you can see, boys and girls would both act violently, start yelling and being abusive, just as the teacher had done just before them. So I think the flip side of this is, of course, as a teacher, there's a huge honour, but also responsibility that you have in terms of role modelling correct and the right behaviour for children to see, and having that self-awareness in the first place to know what are the sorts of actions and behaviours and thoughts and feelings that you want to express that would also be likely be role modelled by your students is a really powerful and important thing to remember. And I think having that self-awareness in the first place can make you ultimately better role models for students going forward. Also worth calling out here is that girls were more likely to role model their same-sex teachers and role models rather than boys. So particularly for the female teachers, the impact that you have on the KIB girls is huge, and just keeping that in mind in terms of another benefit and reason for developing self-awareness in the first place. So if we go on to internal self-awareness, a reminder of this is about how clearly we see our own values, passions, aspirations, etc. How do we do it? How do we foster and cultivate internal self-awareness? So there's many and varied approaches here. We've got 6 up here on the screen now, and we will go into each of them. So firstly, and quite obviously, creating time and space. You will not be able to develop insight into yourself and know who you are without actually carving out the space and time to do it. It's not something necessarily that will just come to you. What are you doing in that time and space? Ultimately, practicing mindfulness. So really paying attention and being quite cognizant to your own self, interests, values, strengths, things that you want to work on, things that you like and would like to role model, just really attending and tuning into those. Exploring your own strengths, interests, and values. And we looked at this a few weeks ago and how this links to our students and the children at KRB, but looking at how you can do it yourself. And we'll go into that in more detail. Also identifying your own teaching style. And I'm sure as teachers, you're already sort of aware as to how you are, or at least have some sort of concept of how you teach and know what your own preferred ways of teaching would be. But also we're going to go into that in more detail in terms of what are the 4 main teaching styles and also the impact on students. Recording your awareness, again, it may seem obvious to actually write down and journal or consciously recognize what your interests, strengths, values are and your teaching style. But I do suggest taking notes on that to actually help cultivate that internal awareness. That does develop over time. This is why journaling is a hugely important technique that we use for those with or even without mental illness, because it helps to put those sometimes irrational or non-objective but more subjective thoughts and feelings that can go around our heads. By putting it on paper, it does make it more objective. It helps you to develop, we found self-awareness for one, but also that self ability to identify patterns within and amongst yourself, and also in the writings that you take down. So always recording. And finally, if there are deficits or gaps that you would like to work on, cultivate internal self-awareness, of course, by seeking professional development and extra help to upskill. Just on that first one, practice mindfulness. And what does that actually mean and do? A reminder that we looked at before, one of the ways to think about self-awareness is, what am I thinking, feeling, and doing? And it almost is a mini CBT strategy in itself. But how you can do this as teachers in terms of practicing mindfulness is being almost hyper observant to yourself. As we've looked at before, it's important to hyper observe children and students because that helps develop insights, but doing that and applying that to yourself. So really tuning into thoughts and feelings and also your actions. So it may even be something as simple as saying, oh, interesting, Mrs. Jones, I just realized that, you're talking to yourself. I've just realized you always tend to walk out of the class at the end of the lesson and take a big breath out. And what does that mean? So it's more just attending to things in yourself. So in that case, you can start developing a self-insight that almost every lesson is exhausting to you. Or it might be that it's always like, oh, like a relief, like a sigh of, oh, that was a good lesson. And that's almost something you do. And then what does that mean? So those are the sorts of little things that you can do to think about in terms of really tuning into your own actions, thoughts, and behaviors and feelings. As mentioned, we looked at strengths, interests, and values and looking at them in terms of our students. But of course, what's equally as important is knowing your own strengths, interests, and values as teachers. So a reminder that these are the 3 elements that we look at in terms of developing self-awareness, and we will go into each of them and how you can specifically do them. A reminder that, of course, KIB already does a huge amount on this, and you may have already done your own VIA character strengths, in which case, excellent. And how do we really remind you about how to use them? How do you remind yourself as to how you can take those strengths away and start implementing them and the lessons around those in your own teaching and professional lives, but also outside of KIB? So you may have already done this, but a reminder that these are the different strengths that VIA character strengths looks at. And there's 24 of them, each with different virtuous categories. So just up on screen, but I would go and suggest you do there is a free assessment online. You can also download a 24 character strengths report if you wanted to, but I think at the minimum, it's good to still at least get that list of top 24 strengths you have. Obviously, this sort of report will give you some more insight into what does it actually mean, and particularly why I like it is that bottom right, as you can see, how others describe you. So that can start to help give you some insight into not only obviously the internal self-awareness we've looked at, but also the external self-awareness and understanding how others may think of you as a result. Another tool that we looked at previously for students was, of course, the Clifton Strengths. I think this is an excellent tool that you can also go on and get yourself as a report, and you can help to identify the top 5 themes in particular. This is a great tool because it gives you, again, different things to think about. On the right hand side, you can see for each of them. So your personalized strengths, what makes you stand out. And as we know, amplifying strengths is far more advantageous to your ultimate success, both as a teacher and personally, by working on strengths rather than focusing on weaknesses. So I think this is particularly important to keep amplifying those strengths, and also gives you questions to start thinking about. Something there that I would suggest to do is actually to write them out, and going back to that journaling, write it actually out to take notes as to how you can yourself continue to leverage these strengths in your personal lives. This book itself was something we were given and assigned to do early on as psychologists, and think it's an excellent book because it goes into each of the top 24 strengths. This will help you to develop your own internal self-awareness, but of course, there's takeaways in here for how others will see you, and outside of that, you can find different ways that you can start leveraging your own strengths. There is an access code to do that Clifton Strengths in this book as well, so I think that's a really worthwhile purchase. In terms of elevating all of this and how to do this all in a psychometrically valid and reliable setting, obviously psychologists administer tests such as the Saville-Wave competency profile is an excellent one. What it does here, as you can see, gives quite a robust amount of detail around what are your specific strengths in different categories and ultimate potential. Also gives you predicted cultural and environmental fit, so performance enhancers and inhibitors, so ways that you can ultimately also develop and super enhance those strengths that you've already got, which I believe is a hugely important to do, and also things where you may want to look out for. Extended on that is the cognitive abilities assessment, which will give you, rather than more personality strengths, this is more cognitive aptitude, which is potentially useful to have, and different strengths here and aptitude scores are on verbal, numerical, error checking, spatial, mechanical, and diagrammatic. And in terms of interests, how can you really identify your own interests beyond thinking about your own personal interests that you enjoy? This is a great tool that we also looked at last week in terms of working out whether you identify as being more, for instance, realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and or conventional. This is another excellent tool that is useful in helping narrow in on what are your interests and how that applies potentially to your work as a teacher, and also can help, as you can see, align whether are there certain areas of what you do, for instance, in a professional setting, that may be more useful to know about. For instance, would you be an excellent, for instance, science teacher as opposed to maybe a PE teacher, for example? So those sorts of things help narrowing in on your interests and really using them to your advantage as a teacher and in your professional context, but also personally. And finally, values. So the Sacred Heart goals are, of course, a hugely important and overarching way and framework for us to behave and what we stand for, and what are our principles ultimately as teachers, but also as individuals. These are great to have as a framework. As we looked at for students as well last or 2 weeks ago, it's important to also think about that's the overarching value, but what are also your own personal values, and what do you yourself really think is important in terms of the way you act and how you prioritize certain aspects of your life and also your professional context. And also knowing that, of course, you can be influenced and vice versa, hugely influential of your students in your classroom and their values. So both by being role models of King Copper Rose Bay's Sacred Heart goals, but also your own values and how that has a downstream impact for our students. If you want to have some options as to where to know what values are, this is a good one pager that we have on Maximinds that can give you some indication of different types of values. Ultimately, it's about looking through them, trying to prioritize and rank order ultimately what are your most important values that you think are, I guess, most important in guiding your own behavior. And again, this could be both professionally but also personally. Just want to make clear that this is probably the only thing I've put up that is related to Maximinds myself. I'm not affiliated with any of the other tools and different suggested assessments that you do, that they're all independent, just so that you know I'm not benefiting from any of those at all, but do suggest them quite strongly, and I think they're all really excellent tools based off what I've seen myself in the market, and obviously practicing and that I use as a psychologist myself. Now on to another way to cultivate internal self-awareness is, of course, learning more about your own teaching styles and the impact they have on your students. So an overview of the 4 main teaching styles that I would like to talk to you about today. These vary in terms of the level of control that you exert over students as a teacher and also the level of warmth. So as you can see, there is a high amount of control and a high amount of warmth, leading to an authoritative teaching style. And on the flip side, there can be a low warmth and low control environment, leading to a more neglectful learning environment for students. You can also have a high amount of control, but a low amount of warmth, so more authoritarian, and a high amount of warmth and a low amount of control, leaning to more permissive. Let's look at each of these in more detail. So to start with, authoritative is frankly the gold standard because there is a high amount of control. So you as the teacher definitely have the authority in the classroom, but you also have a high level of warmth for your students. So there's that care and regard as well. So this would be described as a firm but fair teacher. There are ample amount of class discussions and it's like a two-way street, and students are typically engaged. In the captions here, we have what the responses would look like for a teacher such as yourself in the instance where there may be some challenges or difficulties with students. So if something goes wrong, for instance, an authoritative teacher may say something like, well, actions have consequences, but I'll take your perspective into account. So in that instance, you can see there's high control, but there is also high warmth, and there is that openness to learning about a student's perspective as well. The impact of this particular teaching style on students is, of course, very positive. Students have a high level of self-esteem and confidence. They have a better emotional quotient, and they have excellent social skills as a result. So this is the ideal standard in terms of teaching styles because of the impact it has on students. There's no uncertainty because there's control with firm boundaries, but there's also that warmth and rapport that's built outside of that so that they still know there is at least they are supported when things do go wrong. We will look more at this particularly in the next week's webinar on prevention and how to really build out the authoritative teaching style. The second teaching style that I would like to cover is authoritarian. So in this instance, there is a high level of control and there's little or low warmth. So this is more grounded in direct instruction, more one way, quite strict enforcement of rules, regulations in the classroom, and as a result, you'll typically have more quiet students. So things that may say on extreme are, because I'm the teacher and I said so, or this or at least might be a thought, and the perspective that students might need to toughen up. The impact of this on students is, of course, not positive. So students, because of that low warmth and high control, without the support, there's obviously higher stress and anxiety on students. They would also have typically lower self-esteem because there's not that supportive environment, and potentially poorer social relationships and dynamics in the classroom with an authoritarian teaching style. On the flip side, the permissive teaching style has particularly high warmth and a teacher that's really involved and very supportive, but little to no control. So prepared and caring teachers, and you may spend a lot of time and energy invested in students and their growth. Students, on the other hand, are frankly ruling the roost, and they're the ones that aren't necessarily as engaged. So the control really sits with the students rather than you as a teacher. This may sound like, or in your mind, things like, well, kids will be kids and they'll grow out of it. So there's a lot of allowances made for students, which can, of course, have impacts also on children and students growing up. So, for instance, there may be some self-control issues. They may have poorer social relationships because they aren't taught boundaries themselves. And finally, this can impact particularly on their academic performance because, as mentioned, they get to rule the roost. They'll determine when they do or don't hand in homework, things like that. And finally, we have the neglectful teaching style. In this instance, a teacher may not be as prepared. They may know just a little bit about the students, if at all. And again, students as a result do as they wish because there's not the boundaries and frameworks set for students. This involves, as you can see, a low level of warmth and a low control. So neither of those things are existing in the classroom there. Teachers may think things like, I'm their teacher, not their parent, and I'm here for the job. Do want to call out that appreciate that you are their teachers and not their parents, and that is absolutely a fair thing to think or say, regardless of whether there's a neglectful teaching style. I think the point is here more so is that it's that lack of warmth and regard that comes with that statement particularly, and less of that warmth that typically would come with a teacher who has more of that warmth and is involved and takes their responsibility on as a teacher as the students and their children's ultimate carer in that exact moment. So it's more of that reluctant and dismissive perspective instead. The impact on students with a neglectful teaching style is also not ideal. Higher stress and anxiety because of that lack of warmth, lower self-esteem because they don't have necessarily that control as well themselves, and there also is poor academic performance. Overall, I want to point out the consequences of two particular teaching styles on students, and that is the authoritarian and neglectful, which both can result in self-esteem issues for children's students. The reason for this is ultimately because of that warmth or lack thereof in the classrooms. So students feel like their opinions aren't necessarily valid or validated, as we've looked at in previous webinars, which is means that they're not necessarily supported and feel like they are the subordinate in the classroom. That does not necessarily have support when things go wrong. So that's something to keep in mind of the impact of those particular styles. On the flip side, when students are exposed to teachers who have quite high control, and less of the control is with them, they feel quite disempowered, and that can also lead to academic challenges. So, particularly for the neglectful and permissive styles, students are, we see, more likely here to have less of that, those higher academic results because they are not having as much. On the flip side, there are downstream consequences for students when there are less control. There's less control in the classroom. So, particularly with teaching styles that are more permissive and neglectful, students will typically have academic challenges. So, because of that lack of control that a teacher may have in the classroom, and students are allowed to, or not necessarily allowed, but naturally become more in control of the classroom and given that free reign or take that free reign, they have are less obviously bound to complete their homework, be followed up with assignments that aren't submitted, for instance, don't have as much of that discipline that can result in more academic challenges as a result. So ultimately, the key takeaway here is really reflecting on how you have that level of control and warmth in the classroom. And it is okay to have the control, and it's good to have it as long as that's supplemented with the warmth, particularly so that students know that they will be supported when things don't necessarily go as according to plan, or they don't perform as well as they can, and particularly when there is quite a strict and regimented way to discipline students and deliver content. Again, they feel more supported. That's more likely to reduce the amount of mental illness in the classroom. Finally, onto external self-awareness. And a reminder, this is about how we can understand how other people view us in terms of our own self-concept and how that fits within our own values, passions, aspirations, etc. Many ways to cultivate external self-awareness. Some of these are including, again, creating the time and space. You are not able to understand and learn about what other people think of you, ultimately, if you don't dedicate the time and space. In order to do that, it's in allocating the time and space to seek different perspectives. So going out and getting that feedback and paying attention to what people are saying and hearing and actively seeking out what they want to tell you. And then, of course, it's about practicing active listening, which of course we've looked at last week as one of the key steps in connecting with students, but also using this to connect not only with students when seeking those different perspectives, but also peers. And we'll look at how you can seek the different perspectives and who to actually listen to. By extension, it's once getting that feedback, it's asking what rather than why, and we will look at why that's important. Comparing with internal self-awareness, so what you've actually decided on and ascertained for yourself and what you've discovered that's important to you and your own strengths, interests and values, and then comparing that to that of what the perspective is of others is really important to get that full self-awareness spectrum. And finally, seeking professional development for any areas that you would like to improve on, any gaps that you would like to develop. So in terms of that seeking different perspectives, there are a number of different people you can speak to and ways you can do this. A concept that is a good way to do it, I think, is the 360. And not sure exactly of how the performance reviews and feedback goes at Kinkoppel, so you may already have a set structure, but this is a good way to think about it. So 360 being who's ultimately above you, who's beside you, and who's your subordinates that can give you feedback. So at a high level, this may be your manager or supervisor. This could also be seeking feedback from parents or guardians as people that were almost like peers in your space, also colleagues and other people, other teachers working at Kinkoppel, and also speaking to students and getting their perspective anonymously, I would suggest, to ensure that they are able to feel like they can properly tell you what they think and how they think. But looking from lots of different perspectives, and it's often harder to get feedback from those that are at the same level, so the parents and the teachers, fellow teachers, and also the students. So that's why I suggest setting up things like quizzes or even Typeforms, Quizlets, Google Forms, however you want to, and send it out to get the feedback to help develop your own self-awareness and therefore development. And of course, having structured sessions, which I'm sure you already do, with managers and supervisors to seek those perspectives and honest opinions. And then what do you do once you seek the feedback? Well, of course, listen, actively listen. So key things are fostering that genuine empathy, non-report and judgment. There's not going to be consequences, particularly for students, to give you feedback on your skills, strengths, talents, whatever you're interested in understanding and learning about to develop your own self-awareness. Attending to non-verbal cues, as you now know, is very important and more important than just verbal cues alone. And finally, respecting silence as you go. So many different tools that we've learned last week from active listening, but this is just a high level as to what could help when you're in those actual conversations. Another concept I mentioned before was asking what rather than why. So, for instance, say you've gone out and asked a parent for some feedback and they've come back and said, or you've got the parent teacher interviews and there's that reciprocal feedback process, and they may say something like, "You're not giving my daughter enough support with algebra," if you're a maths teacher. Okay, so why our typical response may be something like, why does she, as in the parent, or even in fact the student, think that? So where's this even coming from? Why would this happen? And that's typically a reaction that can come when we're not sure where obviously thoughts and feedbacks come from. We disagree with it. We feel that we've been criticised, and the why is our first thought typically. A strategy is to think of something like, well, what evidence is there to support this? And the what rather than the why will help you to stay more objective, remain future focused, and empower you to act on your new insights. So it helps us to be basically more rational in understanding, well, what it actually is being said, looking into it again more rationally and objectively to seek your own thoughts on that opinion or feedback, and then go and seek that and act on those insights as a result. So it doesn't mean necessarily that there's an initial reluctance to hear or accept. It just helps to frame what's happening in your head in a more productive and conducive way that does not result in defensiveness in the first time, and it will ultimately help to develop your own self-awareness. Finally, barriers to self-awareness. So self-awareness is inhibited by not doing all of the below things that we've looked at already today. So, of course, by not creating the time and space, which is the essential first step. Practicing mindfulness, so it's not becoming in tune with what you yourself are thinking, feeling, and doing. So without that, of course, you can't develop any awareness of what yourself is doing. Self-awareness is inhibited by not actually exploring your strengths, interests, and values, and almost coasting along with assuming that what you used to be good at is still what you're good at, what you used to be interested in is still the same, and not having any of that introspection in some sort of valid and psychometrically valid and reliable way to help support those perspectives and self-concepts you have. It's inhibited by not identifying your teaching style and developing, again, that self-awareness and reflection on how it is that you are acting in terms of particularly control and warmth in the classroom, and therefore also the impact that that has on your students. It's inhibited by not seeking different perspectives, which of course is important to develop, particularly that's external self-awareness and understanding what other people think of you, and then not practicing active listening as a result. Also, not recording your awareness. It's all very good to have conversations and hypothesize, but actually writing down and recording and developing some sort of written awareness to help take these insights, both from your internal self-awareness development, but also external, to have in some written objective form. And finally, by not doing anything about all of that information and not seeking professional development for any further course of study or any learnings and developments you could make yourself. Other barriers to self-awareness can include asking why, not what. Again, we've just looked at that. So that tendency to be more defensive or react with a why, or what's this conversation about, or why are they saying that I'm not doing this or doing this wrong, can ultimately impact not only the message to get across in that instance, but also limit someone from giving you feedback in the future, which of course limits your self-awareness down the track, which does not help you to grow. On the growth, of course, it's inhibited by having a fixed mindset, which at King Koppel, of course, we have more growth mindsets, and we're all about self-improvement, developing. So, of course, it's not something we need to worry about as KRB teachers, I'm sure. Can be inhibited by power and experience. So typically higher level managers, those in leadership positions, do naturally have less self-awareness because of by virtue of being in that role for years and that confirmation that what they're already doing is correct. But I think it's important, and really good leaders do continue to reflect on this EQ and use this self-awareness to keep growing and developing. So it can be inhibited by power and experience, but I think the growth mindset at King Koppel will help prevent that. And finally, cognitive biases. So when we are biased according to what we always have thought, either our own biases themselves or why we've always thought the way we've thought, of course, it just goes to that inhibition of developing self-awareness, like the fixed mindset, and having this mindset that this is the way it's always been, or this is how I've always been and I don't need to change. So those sorts of cognitive biases can also limit self-awareness. And so to summarize, what have we learnt today? Hopefully that self-awareness is a wisdom, and it's a type of emotional intelligence that involves understanding one's emotions, strengths, weaknesses, needs and drives, the ability to see yourself clearly. The benefits of self-awareness are many and vary, but include greater job and relationship satisfaction, happiness, greater empathy and perspective taking, being able to be more realistic, greater mental health and well-being, and being a better role model for students. Internal self-awareness, which is clearly seeing ourselves, can be cultivated by exploring your own strengths, interests, and values, and identifying your teaching style. Your strengths, interests, and values can be understood by taking psychometric assessments, such as the VAA Character Strengths, Gallup Strengths Finder, Saville Self-Directed Search, to learn more about yourself. You can also learn your teaching style by attending to your level of control and warmth towards students to understand if you're more of an authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, or neglectful teacher, or a combination of some of these at different points. We also learned, hopefully, that external self-awareness, which is knowing how others see us, can be cultivated by seeking different perspectives, practicing active listening, and asking what rather than why when we are given feedback. Barriers to self-awareness include not creating time and space, not practicing mindfulness, not seeking different perspectives, or practicing active listening, and also by having a fixed mindset, being in a position of power and experience, and having cognitive biases. As always, I will give you 20 seconds if you wouldn't mind, please, answering one quick question to help understand whether you have learnt anything today. And if you would like to ask any further questions, please do so. As always, some resources, emergency contacts for you, access to Maximinds where you have strategies, quizzes, articles, videos, activities, and the option to refer any students that you may think need extra support to a psychologist. And here are my contact details and access to the KRB Times teacher page for Maximinds. If you'd like to go on, please do. And look forward to seeing you all again next week.